Hello and welcome to the ABA Journal's Modern Law Library. I'm Jason Tashea, legal affairs reporter for the Journal. Today we have with us Matt Stroud, who has written a new book called The Thin Blue Lie. Matt Stroud is an investigative reporter with a focus on companies that do business with police departments and prisons. Formerly on the staff of the Associated Press, Bloomberg News, and The Verge, he's also written for publications such as The Atlantic, Politico, BuzzFeed, and The Intercept. Matt, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I want to start with the title of your book, The Thin Blue Lie. What is the lie that you wanted to uncover in this book?
The lie is in the conversation that government and police leaders tend to have with citizens in the wake of major police interactions. So the example that I pull out in the book and that I tend to talk about quite a bit is that of Laquan McDonald. So Laquan McDonald is shot and killed by an officer in the Chicago Police Department. And it becomes a major point of controversy because a video that depicted the killing ends up not being released by the Chicago Police Department or the city of Chicago for a period of 14 months in the wake of the killing. And it inspires protests. And when the video actually is released, it shows a very violent interaction and points to a problem within the Chicago Police Department about the way that officers interact with certain groups of people and in certain circumstances. And it really brings up a lot of questions about how police officers do their jobs. And when Rahm Emanuel was forced to confront all of those problems, he stood in front of his citizens and he talked about how he was going to use that the solution to this problem was that he was going to spend millions of dollars on tasers and on body cameras. And that solution that he provided, the answer, was a lie. I mean, he knew that those two solutions were band-aids at best to solve a host of significant problems. And so that's what I wanted to point out. I wanted to point out that technology was being used in a way that was telling a lie to citizens about the ways that police interactions occur and the solutions that government officials and police leaders put forward.
So that was something I wanted to talk to you about a little bit, is that tension that you write about in the book, at least through my reading, is between digital solutionism, as you just talked about, this idea that for every complex problem, there's a simple technological fix, and then the systemic cultural reform that, as you say, police leaders are either unwilling or unable to undertake for a number of reasons. What are the challenges that police leadership have when it comes to making these more systemic cultural reforms that you seem to be in more favor of than some of the technological solutions you write about?
And that's a really good question, and thanks for asking. The police leaders and government leaders, I mean, they're not operating in a vacuum, as our national leaders that are new to the office are now finding. You have institutional constructs that they have to work with, such as police unions, such as, thousands and thousands of police officers who also have interests and who also have ideas about the ways that they should perform their jobs. And it is very difficult to get through those roadblocks and to change minds of people who lead unions and other organizations that affect the way that police do their jobs. And so these bigger institutional changes are very difficult, and they would take a groundswell of interest from city councils and police leaders nationwide to really make these changes work and make these changes happen. And in the face of that trouble, government leaders, police leaders, they're public. I mean, they're creatures of elections and of their jobs, and so they need to come up with a solution. They need to have something to tell people. And so that's where these technological solutions come forward. I mean, it is an answer that is easier than we need to change the way that policing exists and the way that police officers do their jobs and, the way that they've fundamentally done their jobs for years. And so I can empathize with the idea that they have trouble making these broad institutional changes, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about the fact that these broad institutional changes probably should happen.
To dig a little bit deeper into that, early in the book, you talk about a report that comes out after the riots in the 60s that the Johnson administration had put together. And it listed a whole number of community-based policing reforms that would improve public safety and public police relations. I think you put the price tag at somewhere around $21 billion in today's dollars. What were some of those recommended reforms, and what was the reaction to them?
Some of the recommended reforms included community policing efforts and ensuring that police officers play a bigger role in community groups, and that they are more visible in their communities, and that they take part in civic conversations. And it was this report was called the challenge of crime in a free society, and it really did take a comprehensive look at the role of police and the idea that police were becoming more like a military force than a force that was designed to serve the public good. And so it made suggestions along these lines that police should not be a force that is confronting a community, but rather a force that is within the community and listens to the community and is a part of it. The response to it, to say that it was muted, would be an exaggeration. Johnson himself said that the report was overly harsh and that it didn't give police departments or law enforcement in general credit for the successful work it had already done to change policing in certain ways. So the report didn't catch on. And I think that price tag was a part of it, as well as the issues that I mentioned earlier. There were huge institutional constructs around the way that police operated and how they hired, how police leaders hired, and the equipment that they used. And those things were not going to change.
So one of the technologies that you spend a lot of time talking about in the book is the Taser, the electrical gun that shoots out prongs to be a non-lethal alternative to a gun to subdue an individual. This was an attempt by many police departments around the country to have an alternative to using a gun, which was causing a number of problems as unarmed or fleeing people were getting killed by police officers because of gun violence. So this would be a step, if I read their intentions correctly, to move away from kind of the dangerous militarization that they had been going through. But to take a step back, why was this the company, or the technology rather, to sink your teeth into for the sake of this book?
I find the technology really interesting, and I find its history really interesting. And it ties into a lot of the conversations that we've been having since Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson and beyond that. This was a technology that was born out of the riots of Los Angeles in the mid-'60s, and it came from a scientist, a physicist, who watched those riots and similar occurrences where people were being shot and killed by police officers, and said, I can come up with a technical solution to this. I can come up with something in my garage that will solve these problems, that will effectively solve the problem of police killing people with firearms on the streets. And he didn't do this at the behest of a huge company. He was working for Hughes Aircraft when he initially made this decision, but he didn't get funding from Hughes Aircraft or anybody else. He decided that he was going to go about trying to solve this problem in his garage. And the process that he took, he quit his job. He ended up retiring. He very much believed in this idea that he could solve this problem of killing by police. And he became a salesman and tried to peddle this device for years and years, mostly unsuccessfully. And the fact that this idea started where it did with Jack Cover and his ambition, and the fact that it took, decades before it really started to catch on, that process of how an idea about policing eventually turns into a multi-billion-dollar business was fascinating to me, and something that I, as a business reporter who also covers crime, was something that I really wanted to sink my teeth into.
And so something you write about later in the book is that even though it was marketed, the Taser was marketed as a non-lethal tool to be used by police. In fact, there were a number of deaths attributable, as well as there were a number of police volunteers around the country that had been tased for a demonstration exercise that had been hurt through the process. I think you talk about a shattered vertebrae, heart trouble, among other health ailments after this experiment. But what I'm interested in is that you open the book with a vignette where you're at Taser International in Scottsdale, Arizona. You were there for your reporting. And before you left, one of the employees at Taser International asked you if you, quote, wanted to take a ride, meaning did you want to get tased? Did you know about the dangers of these other volunteers that had come before you made the decision to be tased?
No, I didn't. Certainly not to the extent that I eventually became aware. I mean, I was aware, like most people, of the fallout from, what was that? I forget which college it was, actually. I want to say it was down in Florida where a student was protesting John Kerry and ended up being tased, and he yelled, "Don't tase me, bro." Like that was the way that I thought about the taser. I thought of it as kind of a parlor trick, something that could be painful, but something that you would get over, something that would hurt a little bit, but wasn't really that big of a deal. And so when I said that I was gonna be tasered, like, it was not a big concern of mine. And as I point out in that vignette, I was at Taser International in Scottsdale. I was reporting on body cameras. That was my interest at the time. So I wasn't doing any deep background digging into tasers at all. So no, I wasn't aware of the risk at all.
And so what was the sensation like when you were tased on that fateful day?
I describe it for people. There is a description in the book which you should read, but the description that I tend to give to people is that it feels like a Charlie horse that's taken over your entire body. To me, the more striking, so to speak, part of it was how much it took command of your body. Like I was unable to move. And of course, that's the idea. The idea is that it's supposed to make you fall to the ground so that you will comply, so that, an officer can place handcuffs on you. And it did that very well. And that was part of my realization that this was not a parlor trick. This was not something to be laughed at. This was a serious weapon. I absolutely could not move. And for the 5-second period that the taser, the one pull of the trigger is designed to take hold of your body, I was completely out of it, and it felt like an eternity. It felt like it just wasn't ending. Yeah, so it was something that was that I do not recommend that anybody go through, but was also a moment that was kind of my moment where I realized that this was something very serious.
And did you experience any negative health consequences after going through that process?
No, I did not. So there's a bit of an answer to this. So when I was shocked, I was shot in the back. So I was instructed to face away from the person with the taser, and two gentlemen who were employed by the company stood on either side of me and grabbed my arm so that when I fell, I would be guided to the ground. And when you see tasers demonstrated at conferences such as the International Association of Chiefs of Police conference every year, that's typically the protocol. The person is facing away from the taser and they're shot in the back, in the lower back. The risks associated with a taser shock tend to occur when somebody is shocked in the chest, toward the heart or around it. If you look at initial demonstrations of tasers and similar demonstrations at conferences, the IACP over the year and elsewhere, early on they were demonstrated by shooting officers in the heart and in the front of their body. And as the injuries and deaths related to taser shocks began to increase, those demonstrations started to they started to have people turn around because of the realization that it was a risk.
So in your book, you talk about a number of different technologies, not just taser. You looked at body cameras, cell site simulators, which can be used by law enforcement to act as a cell tower to be able to find people's location, or at least the location of their device, and various data collection efforts taken by law enforcement. You talk about digital solutionism being one of the reasons why police departments look to these technologies or data collection processes. But were there other threads that pulled these specific technologies together that felt they belonged in the book?
For me, my interest is in technologies that really catch on and that tend to be in response to major problems that arise in policing. So, the Taser is a response to a police officer shooting somebody with a firearm. CompStat was a response to a significant increase in crime in New York City, and a couple of high-ranking police officials in New York City having ideas about ways to map technology using policing. So that's what ties them together for me is the idea that these are the technologies that are not just one-off technologies that some police officer has had and that they've tried, but these are ones that have really taken hold in policing and extended beyond one or two police departments.
So one of the things that I took away from the book is that you describe, I guess, what could be summed up as a police industrial complex, a type of revolving door between those that serve as police officers that then go into private industry, many of whom you talk about in this book go and work for companies like Taser International. I'm curious how you see, after reporting out this book, this relationship between public and private has affected the development and dissemination of high-tech policing efforts.
I mean, the clearest, and again, a reason why I was so focused on Taser, the clearest example of this to me is with Taser. When Tasers were first instituted, one of the complaints and possible problems with the technology was that there was no mechanism of training or certification for use of the Taser. And so what Taser International very shrewdly came up with, and actually it's an idea that its predecessors, the company's predecessors, people who ran the company's predecessors had thought of as well, is that the company would actually take care of the certification. And the way that they would take care of the certification is that they would certify police to do the certifications and pay them to do it. And so police from one municipality would get certified from Taser and then go to the neighboring municipality and certify a bunch of police officers, and then as a part of that, essentially sell the idea of the Taser to that police department, encouraging them to purchase more Tasers. Then they would go to the next police department and sign on a new certification instructor from that department. And so it's just this cycle, in a way, not only to sell the Tasers themselves, but to employ police officers to push the technology and also make money from the technology. And the best of those trainers and the trainers who do the best to market the Tasers are actually brought on to Taser International to do marketing on a higher level. You mentioned body cameras. One of the biggest problems that emerged in body cameras is that one of those trainers was working for the Seattle Police Department that Taser brought on to be a marketer. While he was with Taser International, he decided that he was going to start a company apart from Taser International selling body cameras. And he eventually quit his job and started a company called VView that became a direct competitor of Taser International. And so it was the idea of a police officer being brought on by Taser International and starting a new company. And so, you have police officers and police leaders and company leaders who are all chasing after the dollars that police departments can provide.
So I think one of the obvious specters of your book is a profit margin being sought after by these companies. And I thought it was interesting. You talked about Taser's 2000 or Taser International's 2001 process of going public, which in your words, you said it would temper the noble aspirations of the company to reduce police brutality by the noble objectives of stock speculators, which I think is an obvious tension. We see this often with publicly traded companies. I'm curious to your view beyond Taser International. Do you think a publicly traded company can ever keep its noble aspirations in the police technology space?
That's a great question. I'm sure it's possible, but that company would have to court, shareholders who adhere to those values. And that's going to be difficult to do when you open it up to the public market. The interest is going to be in making money. And I don't know. I didn't see it with Taser International. I think Taser International deserves a lot of credit. Axon Enterprise deserves a lot of credit, and the Smiths deserve a lot of credit. They're the founders of that company, deserve a lot of credit for creating this company that is now, has a market cap of, multiple billions of dollars. But, their ultimate mission is to gain value for their shareholders. And I know that they maintain a mission of making life safer for police officers and people on the other side of police interactions, but it's not clear to me that they could maintain a truly pure mission as a publicly traded company. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. I was thinking recently I've been tracking the stakeholder revolt at Amazon over their facial recognition technology. Have you followed this?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. So for those that don't know, Amazon has been selling their facial recognition technology to law enforcement agencies around the country. And there are a number of concerns. AI experts have weighed in saying that this technology shouldn't be sold to law enforcement. And stockholders have, or at least a minority share of stockholders, we'll find out how many when the vote happens, are concerned that this technology is raising a series of human rights issues and doesn't have the oversight and transparency required to be a part of the law enforcement's technical landscape. And the SEC has told Amazon that it has to have a vote on this issue, so this will be something that's forthcoming. But it does seem that there's at least a minority of folks that are invested in these major companies that are willing to take the stand. I mean, TBD on what's going to actually occur,
Right.
but at least a minority of stakeholders are raising this as an issue as we see currently. But then again, there aren't a ton of publicly traded companies that deal in specifically law enforcement and police technologies. Something like, you get to see maybe Tyler Tech, as they get more into policing, could perhaps step on an issue that irritates their stockholders. But I don't know if there's a lot of other examples out there in the publicly traded space. A lot of these companies seem to be closely held. Is that right from your reporting?
Yeah, that's what I found as well. One of the companies that I've found fascinating is Digital Ally. They're relatively small. They're in the body camera space, and they went right up against Axon in the body camera space. They're out of Lenexa, Kansas. And because they ran up against Axon Enterprise and a host of other companies that are also trying to sell body cameras, like they actually decided, another TBD on exactly what ends up happening with the company, but they seem to be moving in the direction of protecting patents and protecting patents only. So like their main victory over the last couple of years is that they developed a patent for a body camera that would engage immediately as soon as an officer, say, opens a door or engages the light bar on a cruiser. And they have sued any company that tries to market a product that provides a similar option on their body cameras. I've had conversations with the CEO of that company, and they very much would like to push in the direction of producing body cameras and, or at least nominally motivated by body cameras as a means of transparency, but they've had to move against that motivation because they're trying to stay in business, and they have to do whatever they can to stay in business. The Amazon situation is really fascinating, and I'm going to be very curious to see what shakes out there. It's akin to a shareholder lawsuit, right? And I wonder how you think about it, the situation that they're going through right now, as being different from a group of shareholders deciding that the company has made a decision that either negatively affects the value of shares or has negatively affected the mission of the company. Is it that different? And actually, I'm not too familiar with the vote and why the SEC pushed Amazon to have this vote. Why did it make that decision to step in?
To be honest with you, I don't know. I didn't read the SEC's decision specifically to be able to speak to it.
TBD for both of us then.
Right. And my background is specifically criminal law. So the legal idiosyncrasies of a stockholder suit are not my strong point. But something I did want to ask you, an interesting takeaway for me was that a lot of the stories that you tell about the brains behind these technologies and these processes were all stories of men. Jack Maple,
Yep.
Bernhard Goetz, Jake Cover, August Vollmer. I'm curious if you think the world of policing and police tech would be a different place if women were in positions of power.
Yeah, I definitely do. Um, but they're not. When you look around, I mean, most of the people who are in command positions in policing are men and are usually white men. And so it was difficult to find anybody who is outside of that mold in these spaces. But I certainly encourage women to play a bigger role in policing. Maybe they'll be able to fix it, fix the problems that the people who I focus on in the book have been unable to fix.
What do you think the impact could be if there was more gender diversity at the top of these companies?
Well, not only gender diversity at the top of the companies and at the top of police leadership, but also within policing ranks. I think the decisions of union leaders and the decisions about the ways that police respond to major policing problems would be a lot different. I think a lot of the changes that were suggested in that 1967 report out of the Johnson administration, a lot of those recommendations might have been thought about a little more actively, and community policing might play a bigger role than it plays right now if you had different perspectives making decisions within policing.
Going a little bit broader, a lot of what you write about in the book is the relationship between industry and the police themselves. What sense did you get from your reporting, though, that public pressure on police departments is driving, at least to a certain degree, the adoption of many of these technologies and these supposed solutions?
Oh, I think it's huge. I can't remember the figure exactly, but it's in the book. There's a Cato study that looks at body cameras and the acceptance among U.S. residents of body cameras, and it's like 95%. And so that builds in that solution that I'm pointing out, right? So like when Rahm Emanuel is confronting an entire city that is very pissed off about his city's actions in the wake of Laquan McDonald's killing, he knows that he can go to a technological solution. He can say, I know that you want more transparency between police officers and civilians, and I can give that for you, and I can give that to you, and I can give it to you through these body cameras. And so the polling suggests that people like the technology, like being told about the technology, and are willing to spend public dollars on the technology. So public pressure plays a huge role in it.
And so this is something that you wrote in your book, is that between 1981 and 2001, police spending went from $16 billion to $72 billion, and it has only continued to increase in the almost 2 decades since. But also today we have some of the lowest crime rates in the last 50 years in the United States, regardless of what some of our politicians would have us believe. How are we supposed to square these two things? At one point of the argument, you're saying that this is technical solutionism that's not really doing anything but just making us feel good about the situation. But at the same time, murders are down, property crime is down. So is there a correlation? Is it causation? Like, how do you compare these two facts after having written this book?
So let me preface anything I'm about to say by saying that I'm a journalist and not a criminologist. I don't know the answer to that question, but I think that there are a lot of factors that go into what produces a high crime rate or a low crime rate, and those factors go way beyond the actions of police officers. They, involve the economy. They involve, the way that communities interact with one another, and how safe people actually feel in the street. They involve, the activities of, religious order. They involve so many different things. And with policing, I'm not necessarily saying that technology doesn't serve any purpose. In fact, the CompStat portion of my book, a lot of people push back against CompStat for some very good reasons related to the way that stop and frisk created just a hellscape for many communities in New York City. But the actual technology itself that Bratton and Maple developed, and the mechanism of keeping track of the way that different precincts and their commanders approached crime problems in New York City, it worked. It helped to stem crime problems. And so I think, and that's part of the argument. The part of the argument is that there are good things about these technologies. There is the possibility that the technology can work well. I mean, I talk in the book about how I believe that body cameras are a good idea. I think that CompStat is a good idea in premise. My quarrel is with how these technologies roll out over time and how the technologies are what people hone in on as the actual solution. When, if you look deeper, you find that there was a much more comprehensive solution that created the positive outcome. With CompStat, for example, it was that comprehensive solution to the way that crime was addressed in combination with the technology. With body cameras, I think body cameras are a good idea because they have the ability to create transparency. But as they're rolled out, legislatures and lawmakers in different parts of the country have decided that the footage that is produced by the body camera shouldn't be considered a public document. It should be considered evidence, which makes it a non-transparent device at all. And so, I think there are elements of these technologies that are good. It's just the way that they're used and the way that they're presented, which is the problem.
And so something that I wanted to wrap up on is you just spent a lot of time with this subject and continue to spend a lot of time with this subject. I'm curious, through the process of reporting this book, was there anything that you were certain of when you started that you no longer believed by the time you were done writing this new book of yours?
Oh, I mean, I just talked about CompStat. When I first started this project, I was convinced that CompStat was complete bullshit and that the ideas behind it were, a farce. And when I dug into it, when I found out more about the way that it rolled out and how it was used on a technical level and the way that it was used within NYPD, I became more of a supporter of the idea itself. Tasers, on the other hand, I was I wouldn't say that I was supportive of tasers when I first started, but I was certainly more middle of the road. I was more of the opinion that tasers were potentially a good thing, but that more attention needed to be paid to the number of lives that have been lost in the wake of taser interactions. And toward the end of my reporting, I really got down on on tasers as an effective weapon, at least for the purpose that they were initially introduced.
If there's one takeaway from your book specifically for those working in police procurement departments or high up in police policy, what is the takeaway you would want those folks to have after completing Thin Blue Lie?
I want those people to think critically about their expenditures on these technologies and to get a very clear understanding of what the technologies are supposed to do and what the expectations are in general. And I'd like them to pay attention to where the technologies might go. I brought up body cameras and transparency. I think a lot of police departments and, the federal government made decisions about spending on body cameras under the understanding that body cameras would be a way to make the line separating civilians and police officers a little thinner, and that it might allow police officers to better interact with their communities. And as body cameras rolled out, what you saw is that they became less and less transparent, and it didn't serve that purpose. And I think if you are somebody on a city council and you're trying to make a decision about whether to approve funding for that kind of technology, you have to think, am I making the decision to spend this money based on my belief that it can increase transparency, and then really probing whether or not that's the case? If I'm making the decision about whether to spend money on tasers, and I'm making that decision because I believe that they are going to reduce the number of people who are killed on the streets with firearms by police officers, look into the data and make sure that that's really what's happened. That's the main takeaway that I hope they have. I just want them to think more critically about the expenditures on these technologies before they make them.
Well, Matt, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Matt Stroud is an investigative reporter with a focus on companies that do business with police departments and prisons. I'm Jason Tashea, and this is Modern Law Library from the ABA Journal.